She does regular reviews and interviews authors, and she's a regular at the Open Book Festival at all the major book festivals in Cape Town. She's also involved in Women's Zone, but I think you're going to say something about it. Okay, let's give them a welcome.
Thanks, Sulega, and thank you to Summer School for hosting us, because I think this is it's an important conversation. The book is an important book. But let me just tell you perhaps a little bit about Women's Zone, which is an organisation that Nancy Richards founded nearly 13 years ago. And she asked me if I would like to come on board because I was newly retired. And I put that in inverted commas because I actually can't spell the word, and said, would you like to help me? So, of course, 13 years later, yes. And one of the things that we are very keen on doing, because the whole concept of Women's Zone is storytelling and getting women together from all the various different areas that we have in Cape Town, because I think, as you know, we operate in silos, and mostly Crawford doesn't speak to Constantia, Tafelsig doesn't speak to Tableview, whatever, but we try to get people together, women together, by speaking about our stories and finding that obviously we have very many similar stories. So we find that common thread in our lives. It is an NPO. We have a space at Artscape, which is wonderful to be in a theatre complex because we get the theatre feeling rubbed off on us all the time. We have a women's library there, which are books by, for, and about women. And of course, from very early on, because I've known Jade for a long time, probably about 16, 17 years. So we had Jade on our radar a long, long time ago. And in fact, I was around when you started crafting this book. Jade and I were very fortunate to do some writing courses with the late Anne Schuster. And Anne would encourage us to write pieces at every class. And Jade would stand up and read her work. And I used to be like, well, frankly, under the table because it was so good. And her visual imagery in her writing was excellent. And of course, that has continued into her book. Glowfly Dance is Jade's very brave debut novel. And I'm not sure how many people have read it. Hands? Not a lot. So thank you. So it is about domestic violence, femicide, abuse. But in saying that, and Jade will tell you that it's not all horror, but it has a very specific theme. When it was published, it was shortlisted as a manuscript for the Dundee International Book Prize and the Virginia International Prize for Fiction, and longlisted in the South African then Barry Ronga Prize for Literature. It came out at the end of 2015. Sadly, it has huge relevance today as well. It is a very powerful and haunting account of intimate partner violence, as witnessed through the eyes of a young girl. But I want to emphasize that this is a book of hope and survival, and that, I think, is the theme that we should be focusing on. So while it's just over 9 years since the book was published, as I said, it has as much relevance as it did when it came out. I want to talk to Jade about why the message is still so important, how this literature has affected people and has changed people's perceptions, perhaps pushed them towards assisting or even speaking out about gender-based violence, how it contributes to that fight against GBV. But I think also what I need to establish in the audience is how many people are here because they want to write a memoir, they want to write perhaps a difficult story, because this is where Jade will come into her own, because this is essentially what we call autofiction. It is Jade's story, but written as fiction. Are there people in the audience who are looking to write memoirs. Okay, so we can speak to that. Jade, welcome. It's nice to be together again.
Thank you.
It's been a long time. So we've spoken very briefly about the theme of the book, but I think what we need
So
is
the
to
bit of echo
take
again.
it, yeah, take it away from yourself. Maybe that's a little bit better. I think a synopsis. Can you hear if we don't use the microphones?
And I think this is fine.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it just has to pull it down a bit. Yeah.
I think a synopsis of the book is an important. We're going to move further and further apart. Okay. A synopsis of the book is an important theme to start with.
Let's just the interference. It's off. Sorry, is the theme important? Did you ask?
The synopsis of the book.
Okay, a little about the story. Yeah. Okay, so by the way, I want to say thank you so much for turning up as well. I really appreciate it, and for your interest, for whatever interest you have. There's a bit of time for questions at the end, although we have to leave at 6 on the dot, but feel free to ask then. The theme of the book is effectively, it's interesting because there's really two things, and I think the interesting point as someone who's writing about this is I was writing about domestic violence, but as a child who lost her mother due to it. And from my perspective, I was looking at everything that wasn't happening in terms of society, the institutions, the police, the law courts, things in her life with friends and so on who didn't understand. And to me, this is a woman who took us to a refuge to live in hiding under false names in a refuge. This is a woman who went to the authorities for help, and every single time things would go wrong. But it's not just a book about, it's really, I never wrote it to try and depict some sort of horror story, although its pace kind of builds a bit, like, you know, it really starts to build.
You have to, it's sorry, this is a bit awkward. It's the running that you had to do, but I think let's go right back to the beginning. Why did you feel that you had to write this book?
Okay, so there were two reasons, which is one was I felt because of this ignorance and this lack of knowledge of, you know, everything's about the woman. It's all about the woman, and she's not getting out of this. The ignorance about actually it's the society we live in and its blindness, the patriarchal systems that ignore. On some level, people actually want to do things. People say somebody down the road is being beaten, someone in my family is being treated badly, and it doesn't matter what gender you are. There's all kinds of abuse happening, but we can't address it. And I think it really, it's to try and ask questions and trying to get us to think a little bit about if we're going to change, we're not changing what the woman's doing, we have to change what society's doing. And the second reason was I'm a writer. And, you know, I also write fiction, and I thought, well, I have this life and this story. So, you know, we all write our stories first in some form or other, and let me write what I know best as well, and put this into a form where I didn't want this to be my story. I changed the name of the character to a character in the book. But the story's true, except I changed names of places and people to protect them and protect myself. And it's very much also a story of resilience, of how a child can live through this and still go on to believe in the world, the fact that a mother's love can take you so far through life. And so I really wanted people to see a lot more than that. You know, people say, how did you get through that? It's because somehow I had an innate love for the world that was inculcated through the love of a mother, through an excitement for what was around me, through observing, because we lived in 3 countries, UK, Libya, and the Caribbean, which is all in the book, observing the lives of women around me and what was happening there as well. And so the book isn't really about me at all. It's about all of the women that I'm observing. And it's told through this, I wanted an embodied sense of what it's for you to see what's happening, but not ever be told. And that's why it's told from the child's voice all the way through. So you grow up with the child.
It's a difficult story to write. It was a difficult story to write, and I think there are probably other difficult stories that people have to write. What tools did you use in order to put those words on the page? Because it must have been a very painful reliving of the things that you went through. How did you structure the book in the first place in terms of dealing with each part of your life, or the life of May, who is the protagonist with the lovely slanting eyes? I don't know if you've had a look at the cover, but the cover is, and we're going to talk about the cover because you're an artist, but the cover is very arresting. But how did you take each part of the book and write about it? Was it cathartic?
I think for any writer here, it's very important to think of the stages of writing and that it's not just one thing. There's, first of all, one has to just write it all down. And the way you choose to write it is whichever way comes. I think to actually get it out, you have to find all the tricks you can to write about it. Because there are parts you might say, I don't want to put in later. So don't worry about what you're writing in. You know, there are parts I've taken out that are just not seen as relevant to a story, or, you know, the book is quite long, so it can't have everything. But the things to get it out. And actually, I'd been writing since I was about 16, and that I hadn't really managed to pull it into a single story. And in fact, you know, it's now going to be another sequel. It had another section that's now going to be the next book. But Anne Schuster had actually said, and I thought it was always something I held on to, write it as if you're seeing it like a film in front of your eyes, especially if it's memory. So you just write what you remember. And that for me was very easy because I'm visual. There's many other ways of writing, of course. And I chose to write it in pearls, in little scenes that one then strings together later. So I would just write whichever scene came into my mind. I had a list of scenes. I had envisioned, we'd done some exercise where to envision your book as a sort of flowing river. And on what were the moments of your life in that river? What was it like? I thought of music and how did the music change? And when I had this sort of sense of the book, in a way it's a sort of giant poem because it is quite lyrical. I went through those different feelings and tried to then edit it into the feelings of each stage of that part of my life. And that's how I strung it together. But the editing is tough and was hard because I actually edited for about 10 years and still carried on not knowing what to do even when I was offered publication, because I thought I had to edit it, but apparently they wanted an editor to edit it, but I didn't quite understand. So they wrote to me a year later and said, "Are you sure you want to publish this book? We've been waiting for a year." And I was going, "I can't edit it anymore." And he said, "No, we're editing it." So yeah, those are some of the things. Then the next stage, when the editing as well, when I wrote it, it was more like I had an anger behind me that felt people should know. And I really felt that my mother had died for a purpose, that she had been fighting against this and then had died, as many, many women out there do. And nobody saw that story that I saw, that struggle. And people just hear the news and this big drama about what happens, and they don't understand everything that goes into it. They don't also think, and I always think this when I hear about a woman being killed in the news, about the children who are left behind and how that has so many repercussions. You know, my whole family was split up. I had 3 brothers and sisters. We did not grow up together. We were in different countries. And the repercussions are colossal, huge. So and then on the editing, that's when, funny enough, writing it was fine, absolutely fine. But when I read it through as a story, then I cried. And that was interesting because, I mean, for you, for me, it was very obviously tough because I really felt for that child. And some say that writing is a form of healing and therapy, and maybe on some levels it is in that way.
Writing it as fiction, was that a way of you looking at it from a distance rather than taking it completely inside yourself? Because as personal as it was slightly at a distance as a fictional character. Did that help you?
I always wrote it knowing it was memoir. And then when I first tried to submit, very, very early version in the UK, they said memoir saturated. So I then sent it to the competitions for fiction, and that's where it got shortlisted. And that's when it was a manuscript. And that's why I submitted it as a fiction piece. But in terms of writing as a character, which is kind of a play on me, or my as such, it helped me step away from a sort of self-conscious angsting. I didn't want to be preaching. I didn't want to be drawing attention to the me. Now, I wanted to get people into the story that I knew and to get to understand it, feel it. And I really believe that you can educate people by sitting and lecturing about something like domestic violence and femicide, or you can give people the experience and the knowledge by just observing throughout the book, and also by looking at the world, because it is also an education about the world and about women around the world as well. And that for me is the way of telling. So it helped in that sense. It helped me as well distance emotionally on that level, but it did give me that shock on editing of suddenly seeing myself as this child that I felt horribly sorry for and devastated around. Yeah.
I think you make also very good. You keep mentioning editing, and I think editing is one of the most important points. But because we write and we think it's perfect because we do, because we've written it. But the editing process is so very important, and sometimes it's a painful process when the editors want to cut things out and you don't want them to cut them out, but it is a discussion. So for anybody who is writing a book, editing. Would you agree, Jade?
I would say, though, if you're writing, it's writing, and don't hold back, because until you've got it on paper, there's no editing. But editing, it's long, but I think the pain part is, it's really on the sort of reading back and the going, and also having to talk about it was really, really hard at the very beginning. That's the other thing. If you're going to publish, you have to remember, and this is what I did not realize until I saw the book sitting on the table in front of me, and the publisher said, "Here is your book." And I actually took a step backwards and I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I'm in the public. And it was petrifying. Because I suddenly realized I'm going to have to talk about this. And I always thought the book was going to do it for me. So that's why I talk about the process. It's an entire process. So you can think about things. How am I going to put this book? Is it going to be, I could write to help myself write it, or I put it in the sense of as somebody else, as if it's someone else? There's lots of tricks, but don't care about how you get it down, and then let the editing happen after. And it is a process, but I think it was a painful process for me, because that's when I started to see my own story from a distance, and that's where it was hard. But it is slow. You have to give yourself a lot of time to then think about the whole story. So you're dealing with the parts, and then you go to the whole, and that's when you chop and change and forever. But I must say, Beryl, you say that that you found my writing really good when you heard it, but I'm probably one of the most self-critical, so I will keep editing forever. I always think what I've written is terrible, and it's only if I put it away and I come back later I think, oh, actually that's not bad at all. So I would also say write and put it away and come back before you edit.
Very much so. I'm just interested because we've called this autofiction, which seems to be a new genre. With regard to the subject matter particularly, which is brutal. It's brutal subject matter. But if I look at your book against perhaps a non-fiction book like Tracy Going's Brutal Legacy. Sorry, I had to use brutal again because that was the only word I could think of. But her book, how would you, looking back now, how would you see the difference between non-fiction, writing as a this is my story and the way you've written it. Would you do the same again?
So I do the same one.
Write it as fiction?
The same book.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. I think one thing that's been very powerful is in speaking to people about it as a story is that it's given me so many spaces to speak in. So it's been on radio, TV, classrooms. People have read it and felt it. People are interested in a book that's a story, that it goes way beyond the university space. But it also, interestingly, I think now in a sort of more bigger shift towards decolonialism is actually more accepting of the idea of storytelling as a form of ethnography or of documentation of your life, which has value. And the one thing that story does, I think, which gives you so much more of an embodied perspective, of feeling, of a sense of the world that is not locked into a particular educational discipline of only speaking or writing about something particular way. So you are using people's feelings to access the information. And you're also trying, in this sense, I wasn't trying to, if you're writing about domestic violence, you stick to the topic of it. But in my book, I talk about beautiful things that I saw, amazing things in the world, in the fact that we did travel, even though we were living this crazy life. And you can read about why and how in the book, because it's too difficult to explain here. The insights I got into the world, even being mixed race at the beginning, about having slanted eyes and being told to go back to my country when I was a child in the UK and not actually knowing my Filipino father, who he was. That's a whole other part of it. So there's a lot of what's called intersectionality that you can access, the sort of ways in which race and gender and power structures and patriarchy and all these different things intersect. And that's what I was also trying to sort of, everything comes together in telling a story that you can start to then pick out and get inspiration for.
You talk about the migration. And you did have to travel a lot. Your mother ran away and took you with her, but your brother and sister were left with your stepfather. That was later. Sorry, there's a lot in the book. Okay. So the migration also must have had a tremendous influence on your writing as well. And what you saw. Do you want to read something of that now? I think so, because your writing it's lyrical and it sort of softens the blow of actually what the story is about without taking anything away from the story, which I think is really important. And then perhaps we can go on to talk about how your book has made changes in terms of the awareness that has happened because of the book.
So I'll just read two little tiny pieces that's a contrast, or maybe a line from another piece. So this perhaps is just to give you a sense that I'm trying to put into perspective the experience of threat and fear, but also and obviously violence, but also as a child understanding the world is much bigger and has so much else to offer, to give a sort of very broad idea of what life is about. So it's GLOWFLY dance, as in the light of what we called fireflies, glowflies, and the idea of sort of light and darkness being one and parts and the whole of life itself. And this is just a little tiny snippet of what it was like arriving in the Caribbean as a child and seeing the garden, which was very overgrown, that we'd been allocated there. There is a big expanse of overgrown garden, not large, but enormous to us. It has weeds as high as ourselves. Look, a jungle, we say. The jungle is so high. We stand and stare at the tangle of leaves and flowers, butterflies, all colours racing around the garden, hornets, bees, all in the air, snails, woodlice, worms, slugs in the soil. You can smell the insects. As I stand, the blades of grass shift a little. Out of the grass comes a butterfly with big blue wings as big as a book. It lifts itself from the grass, blue wings large and slow, stunning, bright, bright blue, shining like jewels, like water glittering in the sunlight. The butterfly rises up, surrounded by the blue, the brown, yellow, white, and orange red of the other butterflies, and the dry yellow-green stalks of grass up to my hips, wild in their own paradise. The tops of the wings shine more brightly than underneath, so when its wings open up and part, the blue shines out. It goes up and up, its wings flapping as if in slow motion. It rises in the air and circles slightly. In the trees behind it, there are parrots sitting, peering through the leaves. The butterfly is flapping its wings, saying goodbye. It can't stay here anymore. I fly up with it, sailing and skimming with it up into the air, with the birds and trees and the parrots, and the whole world circling up there beyond me. I wish it could stay here with me, but I would rather give it freedom. And then I'd like to compare this to being in a woman's refuge, where as children, we arrived in the back of a van and we had to live with changed names. We all lived in one room, our whole family, me and my 3 siblings and my mother, and all the other families were living in a room each as well. And this is when new people arrived. So I want to also give you this sense of the contrast that goes through the book is all about freedom versus not being free. When new people arrive, the front door is opened wide, and us kids like to stand and stare at the belongings coming through the door like a little procession. This is inside the women's refuge. And usually there's not much, just what could be grabbed at the time, I reckon, just blankets and clothes and a few precious things and bank books if they have one, because Mum brought hers, and things people's families gave them, like a special book or something. But it's nice to guess and to watch the boxes and the suitcases come in. Our special things were a box of Mattie's and Bab's toys and Mum's sewing machine, which she says she will never leave behind, and the dancing lady from Mrs. Lara, and our tennis rackets from Christmas, and our school books. When new people arrive, there's usually a pram of some kind. Sometimes it's big and blue, like Mrs. Simpson's, who arrived with her baby and little boy, with her narrow face with not much meat on it and mousy permed hair. Then the family arrive, emerging out of the small van where they've been cooped up all those hours, with the windows blocked out. And they always look completely numbed, like they don't know what's going on. They're shit scared. And sometimes the kids are playing up to show they're not shit scared of anything. But we know really they're pretending. But usually the mums don't. They say, behave yourselves. Can't you see what you've got to behave? Or shut up, will you? But I can see the fear in the kids' eyes, even if their mums can't, because their mums are even more shit scared. And it's like people arrive without their whole house wrapped around them. And whatever abusive relationship they had, that whatever it was like, gave them some sense of belonging, even if it was a false security. And if you want to see people really naked, that's how the families look. They haven't got a bed, house, belongings, father, home, school, street, future, or past, and not even their names.
That's beautiful, thank you. I think what you've illustrated there is finding that balance between the horror and the beauty of life in general. And I think that's probably, it's a very important lesson for when you're writing memoir or turning it into autofiction or whatever, is finding the balance between the difficult stories and the positive stories. I can remember we had a conversation way back when about how to get the book out into the public space, because sadly, the publishers will only do a certain amount of publicity for you. And in many cases, it's over to the author to actually make that effort to get it out there. We had a long conversation about this. So you've addressed schools. Just give us a sense of how you've got the word out there and what impact this story, because it has, I hate to say it again, so much relevance in South Africa. I mean, we have probably 5 times the number of deaths in South Africa due to domestic violence than the rest of the world, which is terrifying. But let's talk about the impact before we run out of time, because we're going to do that, sadly.
I think there's still a lot more that can be done, because the book actually wasn't ever released in Joburg due to the marketing guy resigning the same week as the book came out, not due to my book. And so there's still a lot more, I feel, that can be done. But it's been really interesting. I think one of the most interesting things has been how men have responded, because it struck me, I never thought I was writing a book for men as well. But men, of course, were children too once. And so many men have come up to me and said, this was my family. Or, and in fact, I have a little brother in the book, and he's also obviously part of this story. And by the way, my little brother and sister, they were sent off to my stepfather's home in North Africa after my mother died. So that's how I lost touch with them when I was 14. So sorry, what was I just saying before that? Ben, okay, so that was the men part, the brother. And the other side is that it also was really interesting how it was intergenerational. I thought we had to write a little ideal reader, what our ideal reader would be, and write to that. That's one trick to use, is create your own characters of ideal readers and write for them, because it can be very overwhelming otherwise. But I never thought younger people. But interestingly, mothers have given to daughters. Somebody told me I gave it to my nephew. Another person gave the book to his mother. The other interesting thing was actually, funny enough, Susan's here from anthropology, but presenting in an anthropology seminar and talking about this and saying, I used to sit on panels where people, in spaces where people presenting on panels about domestic violence on the theory, but I could never say this is my life, because it seemed like a crazy thing to do in an academic space, even though I had so much experience of living, say, in a refuge and seeing what happened. And when I said that, then interesting, afterwards, all the hands started popping up in the room. I don't know if you were there, Susan, and people were saying, this was my family, this is mine, this is mine. And it struck me how much silence people carry in shame, even as professionals working in the field. They won't say, there's still a sense we carry the shame, and the people left carrying the shame are not the perpetrators. And that was quite a big shift, I think, in the academic space. When the book came out, it was just before Me Too. And so then it started being part of that. When it first came out, there weren't really books around much at that time in South Africa. I know the head of Penguin, when I wrote and said, please, can we have a launch in Joburg? He said, well, your time's gone now. Sorry, bad luck. And but unfortunately, South Africans are not really interested in this type of fiction. They're only interested in light entertainment. Then next year, Me Too, then all the burst of memoirs coming out around violence that emerged after. So it was part of, I think, of an emerging time of people starting to speak out more openly. And so in that sense, it made a contribution, I think. And I spoke on many places like radio, TV, some blogs and in medical humanities. They had a talk with Dawn Garish, in literature, in gender studies, in African studies, different departments. And I think then it goes into students' heads as well. And then from there, you have people working more openly with these themes. And I've had students respond. Yeah, the Me Too, I was part of like a student initiative, not from Stellenbosch, but from the students who brought me in to talk to like all the students for a Me Too event. And it was really interesting that didn't come from the academic side. So I think it touched into a very young generation's interest, which is also what really, really surprised me, because I thought, gosh, there's not a single cell phone in this book. No young person's going to read it. And that was what was interesting. Also, young people read it from the girl's perspective and older people read it from the woman's perspective. And I thought that was interesting as well.
So literature can be a change maker. There's no question about it. Is it prescribed reading in schools yet?
No, it's never got that far. It did get accredited by the education department, and they said contact your publishers to let the schools know, etc. And the publishers said, we're not educational, we're fiction, and refused to do it. And that was where it ended. So it's quite unbelievable. But they are overwhelmed. They only have one marketing person for everybody. And I think that's part of the problem, you know. So yeah, but if people have ideas of where people can, I would say 14, 15, 16 upwards, yeah, as a whole would probably be the best age group.
And it's been a long journey. I mean, this is the journey of your life. How healing has putting this book together been? I mean, I know that there have been points where you have been reunited with members of your family that you had lost. How healing in general do you feel this book has been for you? Because I think in many ways, people who are writing their memoirs, especially if there's a difficult story, it should be healing. One would hope it would be healing to a large extent, that you find relief in putting those words on the paper.
I think one of the biggest healing parts is it's like I've written at there's this kind of, I don't know what you call it, the bit at the end of the book where I've written the thanks. And I've also said, if this book does end up with just one woman managing to leave a relationship where her life is at risk, you know, and you think of the children as well that benefit from that, then it's done its work. And I think it's had quite a lot of impact in that way. So I'd say, first of all, for me, I can't ever undo my own mother's death, but I can at least hope that this does change people's minds, make small changes. I don't think it's going to be the only thing to make change. Many other books out there doing the work, but it's all about, I say, you've got to have lots of little bits of sand moving before you have the landslide, you know. And so to be able to contribute to some sort of changes that make things easier, if people read the book and think about what actually was wrong in those systems, don't look at the mothers so much, but what was wrong in the systems around that were not able to help, and why, even how people think. The healing on a personal level, I think on one level you never heal. On another level, you come to terms with a lot of things, and there are constant kind of awakenings of understanding of what this means to you. I mean, this book it's not just about that experience. You know, after that, I then had foster homes. I had to deal with a number of foster homes. I had to deal with losing all of the rest of my siblings, you know, and I had to sort of figure out who I was in this world, even culturally and ethnically, having identified with the Caribbean and then ended up back in the UK as somebody who wasn't seen as British with my siblings abroad. And in fact, all my siblings are African. So it's really all of that. It's, you know, is that healing? Is it not? Talking about it, getting over that fear, has actually been very healing. And in fact, before I brought the book out, I also sat in it because I was petrified before I'd said yes to the publishers. And I spoke to Malika Ndlovu, if you don't know, if she's written a lot about personal things of hers as well. And I said, should I do this? She said, you know, Jade, people have come up to me and said, thank you at the end of talks. Thank you for telling this story, because I feel I can tell mine. And you won't, and that will happen. And it has happened many, many times that people have said, thank you. And that is a very healing thing too. I think also, Beryl, you're trying to allude to the recent event that out of the blue, over 40 years later, my little brother and sister contacted me, who I'd had no contact with at all. And through Facebook, they saw it online, and then he saw the book, it was my brother first, and ordered GLOWFLY Dance and read it, and then connected with, so knew it was me. And it actually helped us get through a lot of hurdles, because they'd actually had to live with their father, who they'd seen kill their mother. And that's a whole second other thing. But it was, it was very tough. So I wouldn't say it was healing. I'd say it was extremely dramatic. It was very traumatic at the time. And it took a few months to just work through all of this that it brought back up again about the loss and what should have been and could have been. But at the same time, it's obviously allowed us to connect in a way that's much, much more truthful and authentic, because they had also, sometimes been told lies or it been covered. The family wouldn't speak about it, for example. They knew it, but they claimed it was a car crash to other people, but the children knew the truth. What the children have to go through is really one thing I feel we don't look at. We do not look at the experience of children. I know in research, it's a very tiny, new emerging area that they're starting to look at. And I think until we realize that domestic violence isn't just a woman's problem, it's everybody's problem. It's all of us. It's the children that live there. It's the relatives. It's the silencers. And then there's, with that comes the permissions. But, we're looking at what's going on. This isn't domestic violence, but if you look at what's in the US right now and the silences emerging there, it's quite interesting. What is that going on in society that we're not able to sort out yet? But I am optimistic. I do believe that, well, you don't really have a choice. I think that's how I've looked at things. You can choose to give up, or you can just choose to say, hey, it's going to be great. Let's make something of this, and that's where I feel you have to choose to believe that it's possible, else it won't be. And then you're giving up.
I want to just speak about, sorry, the cover very quickly, because we spoke about it briefly and you wanted to mention that.
I would love to open up for questions, but just so you know, the original cover, the publishers had a Caucasian girl on the cover. And I said, it's very beautiful, but actually the first bit of the book is all about being half Filipino and having slanted eyes. And I think you need to change the cover. And they said, and put an Asian girl on. And they said, well, we can't do that now. But the readers won't mind. So I said, well, I said, I think if it was a white person and you put an Asian girl on the cover, I think you would change it. So in the end, they did change it, but they didn't. In the end, I said, do you have any childhood photos? I said, no, I really don't have much at all. And then I said, why don't you merge my eyes with a cover and Photoshop? And then they said, no, we can't do that. It's too much work. And I said, no, I do art. I know that the designer can do it. And so that's what they did. So the cover actually has my eyes merged with this Caucasian girl's face. But this is just an interesting extra thing. But let's have questions, yeah?
Yep, I think so. I think what I've got out of this, if I may say, is that one has to be honest. And I think that this book is honest, authentic. It's telling a story. It's opening doors to what really does happen in domestic violence. I hope that we've come a fair way in the last 9 years to things being better for the victim, and the victim not being treated virtually as a perpetrator. It's your own fault type of thing, the patriarchy that has gone before. But I think that this book has gone a long way to actually changing those things, albeit it may seem to be in a small way, but it's there and it's speaking to that. So thank you, Jade. Are there questions? Can I give you, or can you shout?
Well, I could shout, but thanks, Jade. Thank you so much. Maybe I'm just interested, writing in a way that's authentic to the voice of the child, and the limitations of the child's own knowledge. I haven't read the book, and I'm assuming that she evolves as she gets older. But I wonder, are there a lot of sort of adult side caveats that you make in the writing, you know, to sort of explain things in a way that's more adult, or do you feel that you choose to remain authentic to the voice of what the child would know? Because I guess with the complexities of domestic violence, there's so many things where a child won't know what they're seeing, and at the same time there's knowledge which they have that isn't held from outside. So just maybe a technical question around, as you as an adult write about your child experiences, how do you remain authentic to the limitations of children's knowledge about what they're seeing?
Thanks, that's a great question. What I chose to do is write in the present tense of a child. It's also a sort of coming of age story. It's about what happens, it's from between 3 and 14 years. And what happens when you finally come of age and you realize what the world is really about, in a way, you know? You get this sort of big perspective on the world, and you understand there's something called a past. So a child doesn't really have a past tense, they have a present tense. And so I wrote constantly in the present tense. And in writing from those moments of just seeing, I just stepped into that age and wrote from that age. People seem to think it works very well. It's unorthodox, yeah, but I don't think it hasn't been done by others before. But that's how I did it. And so there are times when you don't know what's going on, but also I didn't know what was going on. But interesting, when you read as an adult, you know exactly what's going on. And I even had insights when I was reading through to edit. I thought, oh my gosh, that was what was happening, you know? So it's only late. Sometimes when you write your own, just write from your truth, you go back and you start to see much more than you thought you saw. Even if you're talking to people about it after, there starts to be more stories and more connections that emerge from it. So there's a lot that can happen, even if you're writing for your own family. I think there's a lot of benefit for people being able to then understand so much more that they didn't understand before. So it's brave, but it helps. It's helped my little brother and sister in a big way to, I think, come to terms with a lot of things in their lives. A lot of things they, as very young children, it was when they were 6 and 8, they really didn't, they sort of knew what was happening, but they had no explanation for it and were given no explanation afterwards. So it filled in all of those gaps. But it was obviously really hard for everybody, really hard.
Any more questions? Or are you desperate to get home for supper?
Hi. I've got to think about how to word this in the way that I want to. But in terms of perspective, I feel as though someone who's gone through obviously a horrific time growing up, children that go through these things tend to develop extreme levels of empathy and coping mechanisms which justify behaviors. And I wonder, as an adult writer, did you feel yourself fighting off empathizing with the perpetrator, or not really? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, actually, I think because the perpetrator came into my life when I was a good 5 years old. And so I had a fairly clear idea of life at that stage. It was actually very, I was reading from very, very young. And so I had a sense of the world and certain things. And so we always had this idea that, and also he was, when we were very young, he was away more often during the week and then back on weekends. So we had a sense of when he was there and when he wasn't, and what was normal and what wasn't. So he was labeled abnormal to us. And so we never really had that empathy, I think, overall at all, actually. I mean, it was more fear. We lived in, I think if you read the book, you'll see how it was. But yes, my little brother and sister, I've since realized that my brother had no empathy at all because he was old enough to understand at 8. But my little sister, she was very confused. And so, she partly empathized, but she had to survive. Like she said, she was 6. There was no mother in her life. She only had this, and they were in a new country. They were actually in Egypt. So she had no familiarities in another language. Her first language is now Arabic, She wears a hijab. That's my sister. And so I'm like having to come to terms with also this aspect of it challenges identity on a huge scale. When you look at the repercussions of one person's violence on a whole family, my other half sibling is South African, you know, and so, but we have huge rifts as well, you know, because of the whole race stuff in South Africa too. So there's a whole lot of things going on that have come through that. So who's empathizing? I think because I bonded with my mother and my other sister did, and we spoke a lot about it. That also was a very healthy thing, I thought, that we spoke between each other, and that my little brother and sister, being so young, were the more vulnerable ones. So you have to think of the age, I think. I hope that answers your question. I don't know if there's anything else really urgent, because I know that they have to go.
To revisit that, could you just, that was the book is.
I was always writing from very young. Did you mean forget rather than forgive? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I was, and as I said, I was writing from 16, so things were very, very fresh in my mind. I wasn't really able to write freely before 14, and I also had my mother's court case notes, because there was a whole court case going on at the end of the book, which, you know, obviously is part of the story. And I had to get some part-time work because we had no money. We were homeless in the West Indies. It's part of the story. And I was working in the law firm as sort of helping out with photocopying notes. So I photocopied all my mother's notes secretly for her to have a copy, and I still have those notes. So I also have those as well to back up my own memories. But we did speak very openly because these things also impacted on us. You know, I also had to give a witness statement when I was about 12, and that's also part of the story as well, and what it means to be a child having to give a witness statement against was attempted sexual abuse, grooming, right? But he didn't. Fortunately, my mother found out just in time, but then having to be there's a 12-year-old in a foreign country being told to these very unpleasant male police officers, you know, to give a statement, and being left with them to do so. So those are the other things. You don't really forget a lot of it. And I was always going to write the story, actually. I always thought people have to know what's going on here. People don't. I kept thinking, nobody knows, nobody understands anything that's happening here. You know, even when I was in school, they didn't know I lived in a refuge, you know, and nobody knew we had a false name. So something in me was keeping hold of those memories.
Are there any more questions, or do we have to finish, Zilego? Any more questions? Or alternatively, I will just say thank you for your attention. I hope that we've answered the questions that you perhaps came with and the reasons why you came. But I'd like to thank Jade, because it's really a privilege to speak to her again and to get back into the book as well. And hope that GLOWFLY Dance has more of a dance to give into the future. I think it definitely does. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank Beryl and thank Zuleika. I thank the summer school.